Okay, so I had a request from Miss Bree asking me to explain the EU and NATO, particularly how it relates to your book Prisoner Geography. So I figured I would not only explain what it was historically and what it is now, but also some of the current event news surrounding it, particularly with President Trump's animosity towards both organizations, or seeming animosity, depending on your point of view. So, okay, here we go.
Policy will always put the interests of the American people and American security above all else.
But recently Trump got specific about something important: NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And what he said shocked everyone. NATO is a military alliance between the US, Canada, and a large chunk of Europe. It began in 1949 as a means of deterring a Soviet attack on Western Europe.
In Washington, the United States breaks a 170-year-old tradition as it joins 11 nations in the signing of the Atlantic Defense Treaty.
Basically saying, if you attack one of us, you'll get a response from all of us.
All right, so if you call what he just said there, that was basically at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, we had two superpowers. We were a dual power world with the United States versus the Soviet Union. Soviet Union spreading communism, America spreading free enterprise and democracy ostensibly. Now all of Europe is pretty much destroyed from World War II, as is Japan from the two atomic bombs. So that leaves basically us in this situation. Now, prior to World War II, or prior to NATO and the forming of the United Nations, America was basically trying to stay isolationist throughout most of its history. You'll remember in 8th grade we discussed how George Washington's foreign policy suggestion in his farewell speech was to avoid foreign entanglements. So NATO was literally breaking George Washington's advice, but largely because we live in a world where we're much more interconnected than we were back then. And so that's the reason we formed NATO, to basically protect Europe from falling under the domination of not only the Soviet Union, but communism. All right, I'm going to go back to the video now.
NATO has grown since to include 28 countries, including former members of the Soviet Union. It intervened to end the Bosnian War in 1995 and responded to the 9/11 attacks with a decade-long mission in Afghanistan. The alliance has helped keep the peace in the Northern Hemisphere for more than half a century. And now, Donald Trump is threatening to destroy the whole thing. So Trump was in an interview with the New York Times on July 20th. Sanger asked him, can the members of NATO, including the new members in the Baltics, count on the United States to come to their military aid if they were attacked by Russia? Trump replies, have they fulfilled their obligation to us? If they fulfill their obligations to us, the answer is yes. And if not, and then Trump says, I'm not saying if not. Trump is probably referring to the fact that all NATO countries have agreed to spend 2% of their GDP on national defense as part of the treaty. The US is just one of 5 countries that met that benchmark in 2016, and Trump isn't the first to call out countries that haven't.
The majority of allies are still not hitting that 2% mark. Everybody's got to step up and everybody's got to do better.
But Trump is the first and only one to suggest that our commitment to NATO should be contingent on those spending levels. And even his fellow Republicans are calling him out.
Now, I have friends that, serve in parliament in places like Estonia that every day worry about the Russians deciding that this is the time to re-annex and to take them back. And comments like this are not only ill-informed, they're dangerous.
I mean, it's the most successful military alliance in the history of the world. I want to reassure our NATO allies that should any of them be attacked, we'll be there to defend them. And I'm willing to kind of chalk it up to a rookie mistake.
But Trump isn't backing down.
If Mitch McConnell says that, then he's wrong. So all I'm saying is they have to pay.
So why is this such a big deal? Because of the way that NATO works. You see, NATO deters attacks through something called credible commitment. There's no organization that can force the United States to go fight for Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. A country like Russia has to believe that the United States is willing to intervene even if it risks World War III. That's why political leaders of both parties haven't wavered from the commitment to defend the NATO alliance. Until now.
And he used the NATO alliance almost as a transactional business alliance. So that is a complete break with American policy.
And Trump's comments come at a time where NATO is particularly relevant. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, even annexing part of the country. This came just about 6 years after its invasion of Georgia. That's why the New York Times asked him specifically about the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Russia is getting increasingly aggressive on its borders. And if it seems like the United States is wavering, Putin might be more tempted to attack one of the Baltic states as part of a plot to destroy NATO. And the Republican presidential candidate has just invited him to try.
Alright, so let's unpack that video just a little bit. Based on the previous video I already did on Russia and on that first chapter, if you read it, you should hopefully remember that when NATO was formed, Russia saw that, or the Soviet Union at the time, saw that as a major threat, and they created the Warsaw Pact. When the Soviet Union fell apart, one of their biggest concerns were that countries such as Estonia, Latvia, etc., which used to be part of the Soviet Union, would draw closer to Europe and thus the United States. And having them join NATO was one of the things that they most dreaded, and they do not want them in NATO. You mentioned in the video also, or the video mentioned Ukraine and Crimea, and in the book and in my previous video I mentioned how they've been trying to join NATO, but unlike Latvia and Estonia where Russia doesn't like it, I don't know how they would react if Ukraine tried to do it. And people, when Russia attacked Crimea, President Obama and the rest of the leaders of Europe may have done a sigh of relief that it wasn't part of NATO, because then they would have had to get involved. Same thing with the state of Georgia, not Georgia in the United States, but the country of Georgia in Europe. So in this instance, Trump is trying to talk about how they're not making their commitments because they're not paying enough, and if they don't pay enough, then they have no value. It's very transactional. You give me money, we do this. But what he seems to possibly be ignoring is how NATO has helped us in various conflicts throughout the world. Obviously they helped us in Afghanistan during right after 9/11. They've helped us in Syria and various other places. So even though they may not have helped as sufficiently in paying as much as we want, some would argue that we might be paying too much. And I'm going to play a little fact check video that discusses some of his claims about NATO.
You good?
And State of the Union and factcheck.org. And after the NATO summit, the tussles in Brussels, President Trump gave an impromptu news conference. Let's take a look at just some of the comments he made during that conference. Let's begin with his claim about the U.S. funding of NATO. Take a listen.
I told people that I'd be very unhappy if they didn't up their commitments very substantially, because the United States has been paying a tremendous amount, probably 90% of the cost of NATO.
That's not true, not 90%. According to NATO, the U.S. pays about 22% of the direct funding that has to do with the shared military system and the organization's operating costs. The president seems to be confusing or conflating or referring to what NATO calls indirect spending. Now that's how much each member of the alliance, 29 nations, willingly spends on its own defense budget. President Trump is correct when he says that even NATO acknowledges that the U.S. shoulders too large a share of this burden. But even taking all that into account, the president's claim of 90%, that's a made-up number, and it's way too high. NATO says that the U.S.'s total defense spending is about 67% of the total amount spent by all the countries in the alliance. Now let's talk about President Trump's claim that NATO members are shirking their responsibilities and not meeting their commitments to what they're supposed to spend on defense. Take a listen.
After we're 2%, we'll start talking about going higher. I think 4% is the right number. Now, the United States, depending on the way you calculate it, was at 4.2%. And I said, that's unfair. And we have the largest GDP by far, especially since we've increased it by so much since a thing called the election.
That's not right either. The United States does not spend 4.2% of its gross domestic product on defense spending. False. President Trump is correct that the U.S. has the largest GDP of the NATO nations, but according to new numbers released by NATO this week, the U.S. is expected to spend around 3.5% of its GDP on defense in 2018. In fact, the United States has not spent 4% of its GDP on defense since President Obama was in office. According to NATO, the last time the United States hit that target was 2013. While these may seem like small differences, keep in mind we're talking about billions of dollars here. Also, keep in mind President Trump is constantly saying that these other countries have not met their commitment to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Now, that commitment was made in 2014, and it was a commitment made for 2024. So technically, they're not shirking their commitment yet. And of course, as is one of his favorite topics, President Trump chose the occasion of the NATO summit to talk about his election victory in November 2016. Take a listen.
One of the states we won, Wisconsin. I didn't even realize this until fairly recently. That was the one state that Ronald Reagan didn't win when he ran the board. His second time. He didn't win Wisconsin, and we won Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's not true. President Reagan won Wisconsin in 1984. The state that he didn't win in 1984 was the home state of his Democratic opponent, Walter Mondale, Minnesota. President Trump keeps saying this. I don't know why. President Reagan won Wisconsin in 1984. Those are just a handful of the falsehoods we grabbed from that press conference. A reminder to all the politicians out there, you're perfectly entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. I'm Jake Tapper for CNN State of the Union and factcheck.org.
All right, so just to unpack that a little bit, hopefully you recognize that perhaps while President Trump is correct that they have not met their specific GDP obligations, certainly not matching the United States. They actually have until 2020 or 2024, so I forget which the number was, I apologize, to meet that obligation. So either way, they're not in default yet, and America has actually been increasing its spending as well. But I'm going to play you a video in a little bit where President Trump talks about how their lack of ability to pay as much as fast as he wants them to could inhibit his ability as Commander-in-Chief of the United States to be willing to support NATO countries if they are attacked by, say, I don't know, Russia. And as for that last clip at the end, while not really important, I don't know that Jake Tapper mentioned that President Trump has also been saying that no one has won Wisconsin as a Republican since Eisenhower's first term, but Eisenhower actually did win it in his second term as well. So, but despite being told that he is incorrect, President Trump likes to continue to repeat the same incorrect information, either due to unwillingness to accept new information or intentional desire to not tell the truth. You decide.
President Trump seeming also to waver on whether the United States is really committed to defending all fellow NATO allies. Listen to this exchange with Tucker Carlson of Fox News. They spoke on Monday before the president left Helsinki.
Why should my son go to Montenegro to defend it from attack? Why is that?
I understand what you're saying. I've asked the same question. You know, Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people.
Yeah, I'm not against Montenegro or Albania.
No, by the way, they're very strong people. They're very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, you're in World War III.
It's called Article 5. Our Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr is with me now. Why is Article 5 so important, and why is what the president said so significant?
Well, look, Poppy, Article 5 is the part of the NATO treaty that the U.S. has signed up for nearly 70 years. That's essentially a mutual defense pact. An attack against one member of NATO is an attack against all. NATO gets together and decides how to defend another country in the alliance if it's attacked. The perception is vital that the U.S. would come to the aid of any and all NATO countries because it's that perception that keeps adversaries at bay. They have to believe that the U.S. would engage, that the U.S. would respond under the NATO treaty with other NATO countries in some fashion. Why the president picked on Montenegro, even given the question why he responded about Montenegro, is getting a lot of speculation because, of course, many countries, including Montenegro, have long believed that Russia was behind an attempt a few years ago to basically take out the Montenegrin government. And eventually, Montenegro, of course, has now become a member of NATO, so the U.S. is obligated under the treaty to help defend that country if there was an attack. All of this really, it's not that anybody really thinks the U.S. is going to pull out of its Article 5 commitment. The president has talked about being committed to Article 5. The question is perception. Why is he saying this? What does he really mean? And is this giving any wiggle room to that commitment that adversaries may see and may decide that they could take advantage of?
So before I play this next video that explains the European Union, I want to point out that Article 5, the very first time it was ever used was after 9/11, when all of Europe declared Article 5 to be not in motion, to be activated, I guess is the best word I can think of off the top of my head, so that all of Europe would be willing to lend military assistance per the U.S.'s request to defend ourselves against Al-Qaeda after the attack on 9/11. And Article 5 does not say we have to join in every war. A war of aggression would not be one that we would have to support. So if Montenegro or some country attacked Russia, we would not have to go in and help. It would be if Montenegro was attacked. So I do take a little bit of issue with the woman saying that it's not like anyone believes he's not going to support Article 5. And then she goes on to say it's the perception. I was like, well, you can't have it both ways. Either the perception is that he's not going to endorse Article 5, or the perception is that he is going to endorse Article 5. I don't know. This is definitely something that is sketchy, and it's giving the idea that he might not. Now, as soon as this meeting was done, this interview was done right before Helsinki when President Trump met Putin, president of Russia. When they were leaving that conference, Putin decided, well, we don't know if it was an accident or not, so let me be fair. They flew his plane, Putin's plane, and some fighter jets into the Baltic, into Estonia's airspace without permission, without notification. Very provocative. Was that done as a, hey, I just got done meeting with President Trump, between what he's told me and what he's told the American press, I don't think he's going to support you guys if we decide to go in there and flex our muscles a little bit? Or was it merely a mistake and just a coincidence that this happened just after that meeting? I honestly don't know. I'd prefer it to be a coincidence, because that's a world where it's less likely that any sort of ensuing conflict will occur. On the other hand, the cynic in me says it's quite possible that's what happened. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play this video for you.
European Union. Obviously here somewhere, but much like the European continent itself, which has an unclear boundary, the European Union also has some fuzzy edges to it. To start, the official members of the European Union are, in decreasing order of population, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, Poland, Romania, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Greece, Belgium, Portugal, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Sweden, Austria, Bulgaria, Denmark, Slovakia, Finland, Ireland, Croatia, Lithuania, Latvia, Slovenia, Estonia, Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Malta. The edges of the EU will probably continue to expand further out, as there are other countries in various stages of trying to become a member. How the EU works is hideously complicated and a story for another time, but for this video you need know only 3 things. First, countries pay membership dues, and second, vote on the laws they all must follow, and third, citizens of member countries are automatically European Union citizens as well. This last means that if you're a citizen of any of these countries, you are free to live and work and retire in any of the others, which is nice, especially if you think your country is too big or too small or too hot or too cold. The European Union gives you options. By the way, did you notice how all 3 of these statements have asterisks attached to this unhelpful footnote? Well, get used to it. Europe loves asterisks that add exceptions to complicated agreements. These 3, for example, point us towards the first bit of border fuzziness with Norway, Iceland, and Little Liechtenstein, none of which are in the European Union, but if you're an EU citizen, you can live in these countries, and Norwegians, Icelanders, or Liechtensteiners can live in yours. Why? In exchange for freedom of movement of people, they have to pay membership fees to the European Union, even though they aren't a part of it, and thus don't get a say in its laws that they still have to follow. This arrangement is the European Economic Area, and it sounds like a terrible deal were it not for that asterisk which grants EEA, but not EU members, a pass on some areas of law, notably farming and fishing, something a country like, say, Iceland might care quite a lot about running themselves. Between the European Union and the European Economic Area, the continent looks mostly covered, with the notable exception of Switzerland, who remains neutral and fiercely independent, except for her participation in the Schengen area. If you're from a country that keeps her borders extremely clean and or well patrolled, the Schengen area is a bit mind-blowing because it's an agreement between countries to take a meh approach to borders. In the Schengen area, international boundaries look like this. No border officers or passport checks of any kind. You can walk from Lisbon to Tallinn without identification or the need to answer the question business or pleasure. For Switzerland, being part of Schengen but not part of the European Union means that non-Swiss can check in any time they like, but they can never stay. This kumbaya approach to borders isn't appreciated by everyone in the EU, most loudly the United Kingdom and Ireland, who argue that islands are different. Thus, to get onto these fair isles, you'll need a passport and a good reason. Britannia's reluctance to get fully involved with the EU brings us to the next topic, money. The European Union has its own fancy currency, the euro, used by the majority but not all of the European Union members. This economic union is called the Eurozone, and to join, a country must first reach certain financial goals, and lying about reaching those goals is certainly not something anyone would do. Most of the non-Eurozone members, when they meet the goals, will ditch their local currency in favor of the euro, but 3 of them, Denmark, Sweden, and of course the United Kingdom, have asterisks attached to the euro section of the treaty, giving them a permanent opt-out. And weirdly, 4 tiny European countries, Andorra, San Marino, Monaco, and Vatican City, have an asterisk giving them the exact reverse, the right to print and use euros as their money despite not being in the European Union at all. So that's the big picture. There's the EU, which makes all the rules, the Eurozone inside of it with a common currency, the European Economic Area outside of it where people can move freely, and the selective Schengen for countries that think borders just aren't worth the hassle. As you can see, there's some strange overlap with these borders, but we're not done talking about complications by a long shot, once again, because empire. So Portugal and Spain have islands from their colonial days that they've never parted with. These are the Madeira and Canary Islands off the coast of Africa and the Azores well into the Atlantic. Because these islands are Spanish and Portuguese, they're part of the European Union as well. Adding a few islands to the EU's borders isn't a big deal until you consider France, the queen of not letting go. She still holds on to a bunch of islands in the Caribbean, Reunion off the coast of Madagascar, and French Guiana in South America. As far as France is concerned, these are France too, which single-handedly extends the edge-to-edge distance of the European Union across a third of the Earth's circumference. Collectively, these bits of France, Spain, and Portugal are called the outermost regions, and they're the result of the simple answer to empire: just keep it. On the other hand, there's the United Kingdom, the master of maintaining complicated relationships with her quasi-former lands, and she's by no means alone in this on such an empire-happy continent. The Netherlands and Denmark and France, again, all have what the European Union calls overseas territories. They're not part of the European Union, instead they're a bottomless well of asterisks due to their complicated relationships with both the European Union and their associated countries, which makes it hard to say anything meaningful about them as a group, but in general, European Union law doesn't apply to these places, though in general, the people who live there are European Union citizens because in general, they have the citizenship of their associated country, so in general, they can live anywhere in the EU they want, but in general, other European Union citizens can't freely move to these territories, which makes these places a weird, semi-permeable membrane of the European Union proper, and the final part we're going to talk about in detail, even though there are still many more one-off asterisks you might stumble upon, such as the Isle of Man, or those Spanish cities in North Africa, or Gibraltar, who pretends to be part of southwest England sometimes, or that region in Greece where it's totally legal to ban women, or Saba and friends who are part of the Netherlands and so should be part of the EU but aren't, or the Faroe Islands upon which while citizens of Denmark live they lose their EU citizenship, and on it goes. These asterisks almost never end, but this video must.
Alright, so before I play another video that is related both to current events and also just to a deeper understanding of the EU, for those of you that are my students listening to this or former students, the easiest way I can classify it, help you get it to context you might understand. If you remember, after the American Revolution, the first government under the Articles of Confederation had a fairly weak central government, and all of the states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, etc., really thought of themselves more almost as nation states, as countries of their own, in some sort of loose confederation as opposed to a strong central government. So, and then when that didn't work, obviously we came forth and passed the Constitution with a federal government system of states and a above national government. So in some way you could look at the European Union on that same way. It's the central government, and each of the countries are relatively like states, but with their own individual governments as well. Now the difference is they're not like the states in America today, but maybe a little bit like the states prior to the Civil War. Because before the Civil War, many people would say I'm a Virginian or a Pennsylvanian or a New Yorkian or whatever you would call those people, before they would say that they were an American, because they were more loyal to their state than they were to the United States as a organization. And I would say most people in the European Union are still more loyal to their individual countries, be it France or be it Germany or Spain, than they are to the European Union as a whole. And I honestly am not fully sure how much the European Union can enforce its rules. I know it has more enforcement power than the Articles of Confederation did, but I do not believe it has the same level of enforcement that the U.S. Constitution has. So now I'm going to play you a video explaining Brexit, since it was mentioned in your textbook, as your textbook is in your summer reading, as well as in my video I made. So here it comes.
Voters in the United Kingdom have voted to leave the European Union.
I hope this victory brings down this failed project and leads us to a Europe of sovereign nation states.
It's a major blow to European political and economic integration, and a huge embarrassment for British Prime Minister David Cameron.
Britain is better off inside the EU than out on our own. At the heart of that is the single market. 500 million customers on our doorstep, a source of so many jobs, so much trade, and such a wealth of opportunity for our young people.
Britain's exit, or the Brexit as it's called, will have huge implications for the British economy. The EU functions as a single integrated economy, kind of like the United States. And now that Britain is out, regulations could make it harder to move goods across the English Channel. Lots of multinational corporations have their headquarters in London. But now they might find that it makes more sense to have their European headquarters in the European Union, which could lead to job losses in Britain. The EU also allows for the free movement of people within its member states, which means that any EU citizen can live and work in any other EU country without a visa. And the UK's high employment rate has drawn migrants from poorer countries in the EU, like Poland and Lithuania. But many in Britain resent these migrants, and that resentment was a key driving force in the decision for Britain to leave the European Union. So now that Britain's out, nobody really knows what's going to happen to all those EU migrants. So what comes next? A long negotiation between the UK and the EU's member states, where they have to hash out issues like trade, tariffs, agriculture, immigration, and a whole host of other issues. Nobody really knows what this means for the other EU countries. They could rally together and push for even more integration, or some countries could look at Britain and say, we should get out too. But one thing is clear, Britain's exit is a huge blow to the dream of a united Europe.
So before I play this next video, let me remind you that David Cameron was Prime Minister then, but now it's Theresa May who is the Prime Minister, and she has tried to come up with two she has, pardon me one second. Sorry, I got a little frog in my throat there. So as I was saying, Theresa May is the Prime Minister of England, the United Kingdom, and she's had multiple, I believe at least two MPs. These are members of Parliament, think of their version of Congress, step down over how she is handling Brexit. I don't know that exactly what the issue is, whether she's being too strict or not strict enough, but this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. On President Trump's recent visit to Scotland, he did send out a tweet congratulating Scotland for voting for Brexit. Of course, unfortunately, he was incorrect. A significant majority of people of Scotland voted against Brexit, much like we discussed yesterday when we were at Casa de Vista, HQ Vista, that a large portion of this Brexit was due to fear of immigrants, fear of migrants, and fear of the other. And much like in America, that tends to fall along the lines of the older white people within the country or within the European Union. The younger, more multicultural generation of people that also like to move between borders and like to believe in a more fluid idea of what it means to be American or European, they were largely opposed to it. So we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to play you a video now where Trump recently called the European Union a foe.
Who's your biggest competitor, your biggest foe globally right now?
Well, I think we have a lot of foes. I think the European Union is a foe, what they do to us in trade. Now, you wouldn't think of the European Union, but they're a foe. Russia's a foe in certain respects. China's a foe economically, certainly. They're a foe. But that doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean anything. It means that they're competitors. They want to do well, and we want to do well. And we're starting to do well. You see what's going on. We have the best employment numbers probably that we've ever had. Black unemployment is the lowest level in history. Hispanic unemployment, the lowest level in history, Jeff. Women unemployment, lowest in 66 years. Our numbers are great. Our GDP numbers are far greater than what they thought.
A lot of people might be surprised to hear you list the EU as a foe before China and Russia.
No, I look at them all. Look, EU is very difficult. I want to tell you, maybe the thing that's most difficult, don't forget, both my parents were born in EU sectors, okay? I mean, my mother was Scotland, my father was Germany, and, you know, I love those countries. I respect the leaders of those countries, but in a trade sense, they've really taken advantage of us, and many of those countries are in NATO, and they weren't paying their bills.
All right, so to be fair to President Trump, the use of the foe could just be a very poor choice of words. Perhaps competitor would be more appropriate since they are economic competitors so even if they're not military competitors, since we are in an alliance with them militarily, but trade always has some level of competition. That's kind of part of capitalism, but he didn't quite explain it that way. And he's also recently said stuff about Europe has to watch out for their the migrants coming in, or else they're going to lose their European personality. So he is definitely pushing some buttons, and I'm going to play you a little video here to show you a little bit more to understand that.
Like that do? Margaret, I think it's very dangerous, whether it's the rhetoric. President has spent more time in the last week attacking our democratic family than preparing for the real threats.
What do you make of this? Because some of the things, you know,
continuing, as you illustrated with the quote from DNI Coates.
Yeah, and he said something further, right? In addition to that, he said that we're one keystroke away from having the same kind of thing happen in 2018 and 2020 as happened in 2016. There hasn't been anywhere near the all-of-government response that's required to this. We had the United States government come out with an extraordinary set of indictments this week, right, where the United States said it was prepared to prove beyond a reasonable doubt with public evidence to a jury that President Putin is lying about his denials with respect to the election interference, and that we have absolute proof of this. And yet the response from the White House is a political response, as opposed, as Tori is pointing out, I think exactly correctly, as opposed to an all-of-government response about what this government and this nation is going to do to defend itself.
The president saying in tweets again in the past 24 hours, look, this happened on President Obama's watch and he didn't do enough, blame him. What is your response? I know you weren't in the administration at the time of the hacking, but do you agree with Toria? The price hasn't been sufficient.
The president, he's the president of the United States today. He's pitting himself against a unified view of the intelligence and law enforcement services in the United States.
And his own cabinet.
His own cabinet, exactly right, Toria. And you know, the question is, what is the United States going to do today to respond and to protect the nation? That's where this needs to be, not that's kind of political, political issues or blaming. It's what is the United States going to do today? Now, President Obama did a number of things, including putting sanctions and other things on Russia. I would have to say, though, that there's been kind of an averting of the eyes, kind of turning away from the conduct of the Russians by President Trump. I don't think, at least by public reports, Margaret, there's been a single cabinet meeting on this problem. I don't think there's been a single National Security Council meeting on this thing. The last thing, one thing I wanted to say, and it's, I know, Tori, you agree with me because you were alluding to it, it's not just the interference. The list of things, which is why this meeting shouldn't happen tomorrow, the list of things, Margaret, Crimea, Ukraine, the shoot-down of MH17 killing 298 people, the use of nerve agents in the United Kingdom, aiding and abetting war crimes in Syria, the list of actively hostile actions by the Russians since Putin's return to office is extreme, and we haven't had any response from the president on this. This is really his responsibility now.
But that's exactly why the meeting should happen. So the president can take Putin on all of these issues and make clear that if they don't come back into civilized behavior with the international community, that there will be more consequences, economic sanctions, more freezing out. And instead, this is now set up to be a love fest.
Yeah, the meetings that
we're going to have to leave it there, but we'll all tune in for that joint press conference to hear about what was discussed in this meeting. We're going to be right back to talk more about.
So hopefully you're not living under a rock, and that conference that was being discussed in the previous video between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump did occur in the post-conference press conference was probably considered by most an unmitigated disaster. We had just recently had our own government reveal and indict 12 foreign Russian spies for trying to interfere with our election. There is massive evidence agreed upon by the Department of Homeland Security and the CIA and the FBI that Russia did actively try to interfere with our election, and the DHS also believes that they're going to actively try and interfere with this upcoming election. I believe the quote said something along the lines is the amount of noise that they're hearing is similar to the amount of noise that they were hearing before 9/11 occurred. So there is definitely something happening, and President Trump chose to basically throw his intelligence under the bus and side with Vladimir Putin, who said, I didn't do it. Which would be like someone trusting, you know, if you were a Jewish person, it's like, well, Hitler said he didn't do it, so I'm just going to trust him that he didn't do it. Or Darth Vader, he said he didn't do it, so he didn't do it. Or Harry Potter, let's say he went up and said, hey guys, you know what, I asked Voldemort if he killed my parents. He said he didn't do it. He was very strong about it, so I trust him. So I'm going to play you a short little clip of that conference video, and then I'm going to play you a little bit of the fallout and criticism, which has proven to be very bipartisan, I mean. So you have both Republicans and Democrats talking significantly about it.
16, and would you warn him to never do it again?
All I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. And what he did is an incredible offer. He offered to have the people working on the case come and work with their investigators with respect to the 12 people. I think that's an incredible offer. The probe is a disaster for our country. I think it's kept us apart. It's kept us separated. There was no collusion at all. Everybody knows it.
As to who is to be believed and to who's not to be believed, you can trust no one if you take this. Where did you get this idea that President Trump trusts me or I trust him? He defends the interests of the United States of America, and I do defend the interests of the Russian Federation. We should be guided by facts. Could you name a single fact that would definitively prove the collusion? This is utter nonsense.
What happened to the server? What happened to the servers of the Pakistani gentlemen that worked on the DNC? Where are those servers? They're missing. Where are they? What happened to Hillary Clinton's emails? 33,000 emails, gone, just gone. I think in Russia they wouldn't be gone so easily. I think it's a disgrace.
Does the Russian government have any compromising material on President Trump or his family?
I called him a competitor, and a good competitor he is. And I think the word competitor is it's a compliment.
All right, so to make sure you caught some of those highlights there, he basically said that he didn't believe the intelligence community over Vladimir Putin. He once again trying to bring up an old issue regarding Hillary Clinton and her server, even though our intelligence community, led by Republicans, who have said that it was Russia that hacked the Democratic National Committee servers. You also see that when they asked Putin if he had any video or other evidence or anything to blackmail Trump, he gave that very nice laugh. I'm sure it means he doesn't have anything. And then additionally, you heard President Trump call Russia a competitor as opposed to the European Union, which he called a foe. Just keep all that in mind.
And many Republicans were sharply critical of what happened today. Margaret Brennan has more reaction on this.
You can't elevate yourself from the level of a snake, and that's where I consider Vladimir Putin.
President Trump's acceptance of Vladimir Putin's denials did not sit well with many in his own party. Senator John McCain said it was one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. Senator Lindsey Graham said Putin would view it as a sign of weakness. House Speaker Paul Ryan said the president must appreciate that Russia is not our ally. Trump ally Newt Gingrich called it the most serious mistake of his presidency. While the president said he privately raised the issue, his refusal to publicly confront Putin and not back up the U.S. intelligence community, led by Trump appointee Dan Coats, drew a sharp rebuke from Bob Corker.
The president's comments made us look as a nation more like a pushover. And I was disappointed in that.
Democrat Mark Warner is helping to lead the Senate Intelligence Committee investigation into Russian meddling.
If Mr. Trump wouldn't stand with American and Western institutions and stand with his own intelligence community assessment in public, who knows what he might have agreed to in private.
While Republican Congressman Trey Gowdy helped lead the House investigation, issued this statement saying, "Russia is not our friend. Russia attempted to undermine the fundamentals of our democracy." The U.S. intelligence community is now warning that Russia is meddling in the 2018 congressional races. But Mr. Trump seemed dismissive of that warning, and in his CBS News interview echoed similar skepticism about another red flag raised by the Director of National Intelligence.
Digital infrastructure that serves this country is literally under attack.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I'd have to look, but I have a lot of respect for Dan, and that's where he is, and that's what he does. Again, we're working on it very hard.
All right, so Margaret's with us now. So all this focus on the news conference this afternoon, right? What actually, though, when do we get a sense of what actually happened inside that meeting one-on-one?
Well, we haven't heard from the White House any kind of deliverable, any kind of agreement. We heard from Vladimir Putin, his description of what his hopes were on Syria, elsewhere. But if this was about furthering America's national security interests, we don't know what the president actually achieved here in this outreach to Russia. What we know is that these Republican senators are coming out and asking the president to pay attention to something to protect us against a threat that he does not acknowledge even exists.
We hope to get more information on what happened very soon. Margaret Brennan, thanks.
All right, so I wasn't trying to play that other video, so you can ignore that. So based on that, I hope you were able to see that as far as it goes right now, even many of the Republicans, obviously the Democrats, are severely coming out against him throwing our intelligence community under the bus. And even though they are warning of more issues, he doesn't seem to be particularly concerned or to be taking it seriously. It's hard to know with President Trump because he does a lot of talking off the cuff and doesn't prepare things or always show the strongest concern for the exact word choices he uses. So that's about all I have for you. I hope this helped explain NATO, the EU, and our current relationship with Russia. I'll talk to you later. Bye.